Hey, what's up, Hot Thoughts community? Everyone out there that is going to join in for what is Vol.7 of Hot Thoughts. So we're going to be talking about mission, service, and justice. And we have a cool panel of folks here kind of across the globe and across different functions where we're just going to be chatting a little bit about where they plug in and why they're passionate. And so as we kind of normally do, we'll let folks gather that are watching live with us. But maybe just a chance to kind of check in and see what life is like. I know in a global pandemic, this is my first, I think, to live through. And so that's different. And so how are you guys kind of individually holding up during the pandemic? Lucas, how you doing?
Yeah, we're doing fine. I mean, really the biggest thing has been the curbing of the travel, and also trying to be really conscious about where you're going and what you're doing. And of course, I'm on month 4 of childcare / education / I think my poor son is so sick of us at this stage, like like a lot of people.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Liz, what is like, I mean, you're in New York, Liz. What's it like for you kind of going through all this?
Yeah, so we're right now in New Jersey with my in-laws, but we were in New York for a while in Queens. It was pretty hard. We had a number of coronavirus illnesses and deaths in our family and upstairs neighbor, et cetera. So it's been really challenging overall. But it's been really encouraging with the mutual aid and support, like communities and individuals stepping up, right, to cover our neighbors' widowed mortgage, et cetera. So it's been really powerful seeing that. But I also have a 5-year-old, so who cannot be on a computer on her own. So many jobs, work job, parenting job, apparently now a kindergarten teacher job. Yeah, so it's been a little berserk.
Yeah. Shane, what about you in Philly? What's it kind of been like for you?
Yeah, we're doing all right here. We're hanging in. I was out in the gardens today. We do a bunch of community gardens, so it's a kind of a reminder that life keeps going. We harvested kale and beets and have lightning bugs outside now. We've really ramped up a lot of our food distribution. We give out hundreds of bags of food. There's a coalition of us now that are sharing food with about 500 people a day, and a lot of them are vulnerable to the streets, and a lot of elderly families we deliver bags to and things. So we've tried to ramp all that up. And then then we had the George Floyd murder, and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. So we've had hundreds of thousands of folks out in the streets and with masks and trying to be smart. But it's an incredible moment to be alive right now, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, even more than just a global pandemic, right?
Yeah.
John Claude, what about you? I mean, you're in Haiti, right? And so what's it like for you kind of during all of this?
Well, first I was confined, staying home, but busy. I mean, I've been so busy despite staying home. And sometimes I go to my, I live in the mountain, by the way. So I drive down, going to my office. But at the same time, the main issues were with people that do not believe that COVID-19 really exists. Sometimes when they see you on the street with a mask, I mean, they are looking at you as an extra, as somebody who's coming from another planet. So it's been very difficult to convince people that COVID-19 exists. And very sadly, I have lost many friends. I have lost 3 friends I know of COVID-19.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, especially when there's varying the spectrum, right, of people's understanding of even the reality of it. But then there's the stories like that where there's like lives lost for it, and so that's tragic, but a hard thing to have to navigate. And even hopefully people hearing that like understand that like it's actually a real thing and that it's across our globe, right? Well, hey, we've kind of reached like the point where we just kind of dive in. And so I know you guys, not everyone maybe knows you. And so Lucas, would you start us off and just kind of, hey, introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And maybe why are you here other than me asking you to be
here? Yeah. So my name's Lucas Endicott, and I'm happy to be here. I work for the Missouri Annual Conference in the area of mission, service, and justice. So primarily trying to connect Methodist churches in the state of Missouri to mission, whether that's down the street or around the world, which is a fascinating job and ever changing. And I'm here because I love it, like this stuff. And you got to love Danny. I mean, Danny, if you ask me to do anything, I'm going to say yes, basically. So basically,
that's generally true.
Things like that, right? Yeah. But and just excited to be in conversation with these folks. I mean, these guys are the real pros. So it's just fun to be a fly on the wall, if nothing else.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I don't know if it's pros is the word on my end, but my name is Elizabeth Chun Lee, based in New York. I work with United Methodist Women on their climate justice and environmental justice efforts. And United Methodist Women is a 800,000 member-based organization connected to United Methodist Church, but separately funded by women who kind of lead the effort. And so I would say that's kind of one of the reasons why I think I'm on this, and I appreciate being on this, is part of a mission organization that's organized by women for works of justice and faith for 150 years, duration. And for me, really feel called that we are all, whether we are commissioned formally, clergy, lay, whatever, we're part of God's mission. And so exploring that and discerning that and connecting that to like God's call in our world, I think is about most importance. Yeah,
that's great. I hope we talk more about that too. That idea that mission and living missionally is not the job of a select few or the ordained, right? But there is this call to each and every one of us. So that's great. Shane, how about you? Just quick introduction to those that don't know you.
Yeah, so I'm a like Tennessee boy that fell in love with the city here in Philly, and have this community on the north side that we've been building for 20 years called The Simple Way. And I'm also a writer and an activist, and I lead another group called Red Letter Christians, which comes from the old Bibles that have the words of Jesus in red. And it was actually a secular Jewish country music DJ, that's a lot to take in, that was interviewing a friend of mine for a radio show, Jim Wallace. And he said, I've read a lot of the Bible, and there's parts of it that I love. There's parts of it that I find confusing, but I've always liked the stuff in red. And he said, you guys seem to take that seriously. You should call yourselves Red Letter Christians. So we like it. I think we realize that there's a lot of things that pass as Christianity, and they don't always look much like Jesus. So we want a Christianity that loves like Jesus, that flips tables like Jesus, that cries over our cities like Jesus. So that's what we're after.
Cool. And then John Claude, did you wrap us up? Just kind of quick introduction, who you are and what brought you here and what you do.
Yes, my name is Jean-Claude, and I am a native of Haiti. Haiti is a very lovely country. For those of you who have been to Haiti, and Lucas can tell you more about it. So for my entire life, I've been working in development. I mean, working with people who are marginalized, people who are excluded from the debate. I deeply believe that development can not only come from missionaries and the experts. So, the people who are excluded, they have a voice, because if you are not working with them, you are working against them. So this is my motto, and doing missionary work, in quotes, if I can say it like this, even though I'm not a pastor.
Good. Well, hey, here is the shtick. We'll kind of dive into it. And so for those that watch, you kind of know, but what we do is we have 5 wings and 5 sauces. I've had chicken wings for the last 7 weeks, so I have cauliflower tots this week. I had to switch it up. But what we will do is I'll just ask you, if you have a sauce, just quickly introduce it. If you know how hot it is, I love that too. And so my first sauce is called Aka Miso, and it is 116,000 Scoville units, which is more than a jalapeno, which is like 2,000. So it's pretty hot to start out. So Lucas, what do you have? You have a sauce?
So I have a story instead of a sauce. Well, I've got some sauces. So over the course of the day, I thought I got it around at the grocery store. I was going to do this whole pepper thing. Listen, I had plans, okay? And then the day happened as it always does. So I raided the freezer and I stole my son's frozen boneless chicken wing things. I don't know if you can see these. And then I went through the cabinets and I got a variety of sauces that probably will kill me because they've been there for 4 or 5 years at this stage, and I poured them on these little boneless wings. And so I'm sure I'm going to be grossed out the whole time. But I'm starting with a Frank's hot sauce, which is about the most mild, ridiculous thing you've got. But then I've got some of the other bottles as we get further along.
Frank's is my wife's favorite. It's great. We have it on our eggs every morning. Liz, do you have any hot sauces and hot wings or anything going on over there?
I do. And I was worried about wings because with the quarantine, we haven't been able to find wings. But sure enough, yesterday we were able to find some. I'm also not at home. So if I were at home in Queens, I would have my array of Korean sauces. But we did go to an empanada store, a Colombian empanada store. So I have a mixture. So the first one is going to be a salsa rosada, which is kind of a pink sauce that you have with like ketchup and not very spicy, and mayo, kind of. Colombians would say that is not the combination, but it's pink, so I'll with that.
That's a great sauce to start out on. So Shane, you got anything over there with you?
I do have something, and I'll have to say these are some good wings, but I don't have 5 different ones. I do have 5, and they're made by my friends Abu and Naji, who are Palestinian, and they run a wonderful pizza joint and wings joint around the corner here. So that's who made my wings. And but I have friends that do this annual gathering, and I tried to get a hold of them, but what they have is like 20 different sauces. You'll like this, Danny. And they go from mild to hot, but then they have a contest where you go in the hottest one, and you got to present a PowerPoint for 3 minutes. So people are falling apart and whatnot. So that was very enjoyable. But I just got my regular old hot crispy pizza made by Abu and Naji buffalo wings tonight. And
I like that. I feel
vegetarian. I was a vegetarian for like 10 years, so I'm always looking for an excuse to backslide.
There you go. John Claude, what do you got? I think you got something special.
You see, guys, you call this marginalization. Everybody has wings. You see, that's the reason why I'm fighting for the excluded. But anyway, you see. Anyway, I have my tea. I mean, it is made of ginger, lemon, and honey. And this is the tea I had not missed since COVID-19 came in. So this is my recipe, to fight
I love
COVID.
it.
Yeah?
All right, I can dig it. Well, why doesn't everyone take a bite, and then maybe Jean-Claude, we'll start with you since you're taking a sip of the tea. And the first question is just this: kind of, why did you get started in missions work? People ask that a lot to folks in your shoes, and so what was the reason you said, I'm going to take a jump in and do this? And you shared a little bit of that, but if you want to expand a little more, like, why did you jump into missions work?
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, I have to say I was born in a very modest family, and my parents, they were very poor. My mom and my dad, regrettably, I mean, they passed away, but none of them was educated. And in my family, I was among the first one to have a chance to get some education. And later on, I realized that many other people in my neighborhood did not have this chance. And I realized that one of the best way for me, to bring a contribution, is to help them either, getting to school, either or building their capacity to know that they're worth something, that they have to build their self-esteem. And this is what has led me, into the missionary work, working with people. And as I said at the very beginning, if you don't do something with somebody, you are doing it against this person, to make sure that they have a voice, to make sure that they participate. And I even remember some of the works I do in the field of HIV and AIDS. I know I have friends, and I have people I know who died of AIDS. They don't die of the disease, but they die because of denial. and sometimes you take the time to explain to those people how, you know, how they should live. You know, the disease, it exists, but how they should fight stigmatization, how should they protect themselves from it. And I remember some of the work that I done, you know, working with the journalists in Haiti, making sure, you know, I published the first guide, the first reporting guide on HIV and AIDS, making sure that people go public. And you know, there are many other areas where I've been involved. And honestly, this has been my greatest satisfaction, to make sure that there are people who have a better future because of what I do. And as you may know, in communication work, you know, the reward is not immediate. I mean, it takes time. But sometimes you're out and people is calling you Mr. Jean-Claude. Hey, sometimes I don't even remember who this guy is. Oh, remember, you teach me this, you teach me that. You know, you help me to do this spot in the radio. You help me to do this, and you know, it brings you some satisfaction. And even now, I'm still doing it. Tomorrow, I'm heading out of the country to distribute plants. I mean trees, to make sure that in the next 5 or 10 years, people have food. They have avocados, they have mangoes, they have coffees. So this is what I've been doing over the years, and I like doing it.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Anyone else to hop in? Kind of like, how did you get into this? Lucas, maybe you go.
Okay, I'll hop in. I'm hopping. So for me, I guess I've always been really interested in the so what, you know, so particularly when it came to Christian people talking about, well, I've got this belief system and, you know, I follow Jesus and all this sort of stuff. I've always been like, yeah, but what does that then functionally mean? Like, how is your life then different? How are your interactions different? How does all that play its way out in reality? And frankly, you know, and I don't mean this in any way offensive, most of the time when I was looking around, I felt like it was JV Ball, you know, like the Christians weren't engaged in the most interesting stuff. They weren't saying the most interesting things or kind of looking at it in new ways. And I thought, well, what a shame, particularly because you've got people who have all the motivation and intrinsic drive to try to figure out what it means to live a life of grace and mercy and justice and peace in our communities. And so so I had this balance of, you know, very well-intentioned people, but maybe some of the more inexacting models, right, where they jump on a plane and go paint a shed in Costa Rica. And I thought, man, can't we do better than that? Like, I'm cool, like, great, go to Costa Rica and maybe you paint a shed, but can we do a little bit more strategic stuff? Can we put our best and most creative minds together, particularly when you think of the Christian call to be kind of to co-create in some meaningful ways? And so I just find this work absolutely fascinating, entrepreneurial. You meet the most interesting people. It doesn't mean that it's always easy, and sometimes it's doing stuff that's more kind of foundational or fundamental. But for me, that's what it is. So what? What's the point? How is it changing your life?
Yeah, that's good. Shane, what about, I mean, you've been at this for a while. Shane, how did you kind of get your start in the quote unquote missions world?
Well, I really resonate with this idea that missions should not be compartmentalized for a small group of, you know, some sort of like special ops that go overseas or to where, you know, no person has gone before or something, but really that we're all called to missionally live out our lives, as Jesus said, seeking first the kingdom of God, you know, seeking that God's dream come on earth as it is in heaven. And so that when I really caught that vision personally was when I was in college up here in Philly, and we were studying in, you know, undergrad, and then one of my friends said, check this out. And he threw down a newspaper, and it was the story of a group of homeless mothers who had moved into an abandoned Catholic church building, and they had begun living there. And this was, I mean, there were dozens and dozens of families, mothers and children that were on the waiting list for housing in Philadelphia. So what the story told at the end, though, was that they had been given an eviction notice of 48 hours. And if they weren't out, then they could be arrested for trespassing. And the families were brilliant, and they were courageous, just as I was, listening to our brother Jean-Claude share, like these families hung a banner on the front of the cathedral that said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? And they held a press conference and said, we mean no disrespect to the church officials, but we don't have anywhere to go. And we've talked to the owner of this building, the Lord Almighty, your boss. And God said we can stay. And so that sparked a student movement of solidarity that really gave birth to our community. But what I learned from that is that a lot of us, I think we find our mission by leaning in to the suffering of the world. And, you know, so many of the compelling forces of this world are teaching us to move away from suffering. But everything that Jesus does shows us a God that is leaning towards the suffering of the world, and in fact is born a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew in the middle of a genocide, who knew what it was like to suffer on the margins, and, you know, did that even to the point of being crucified and executed on the cross. So, you know, that the last 20 years of my life have kind of been leaning into that and thinking, you know, how can I allow the gravity of the gospel to make me more proximate to those who are hurting in our world.
Yeah, cool. That's good. Liz, what about you? Kind of to wrap us up, like, how did you kind of dive into this?
Yeah, so I think 2 points. One is, so I was born in Korea, actually. So, and Korea is Christians are known kind of as a mission community, right? And there's lots of mission movements. But I think I'll frame it in a different way, like not in the traditional way of, like, you know, my parents are not clergy. I grew up in a very strong family of laity where the pulse of mission was just huge. Right? Loving Jesus means participating in God's mission for the world. So again, it's not about professional missionaries, but we are all called to it. And I think, you know, about mission, it depends how we're defining or understanding mission. It's deeply contextual. It's really complex. And I think about mission movement in Korea, and some of the positive things was about the liberation of self and community, right? I think about my grandmother who came to faith in North Korea, what is now North Korea. And she was seized by the gospel, and she understood that she was a chosen child of God, beloved, that gave her affirmation in a deeply patriarchal and oppressive context. This was also during the Japanese occupation, where their identity, their language was taken away, land was taken away from them. And that's where you know, the Korean independence, Korean independence statement was signed by a number of Christians, and also signed in a Methodist church, in fact, right? Saying, by God is liberating us, and seizing that type of liberation. So for me, that's the liberating work that God provides. And I think Luke 18 and 19 really speaks about that, right? When Jesus unrolls the scroll and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of the sight, to let the oppressed go free. And so I really think that is what mission has been about. And I think growing up in immigrant context in Flushing, New York, the realities of that passage speaking to me as a 4th grader, 5th grader, where I was a primary interpreter for my parents, being like, no, God is present. God is longing for justice for our communities. And God is alongside all of the immigrants, all of the outcasts, all of the oppressed. And that is what the church and God's mission should be about. So that's kind of my journey.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting, like, to hear everyone's kind of perspective, because very different context, but almost everyone's coming at it from this perspective of mission is not, it's kind of, Shane, you said it, compartmentalized, but it actually breathed out of, like, the passions and the stirrings and the pain we experience in our lives and the context that we find ourselves in. And so, yeah, super cool to hear that. And I would say that one of the questions I get as a pastor a lot in my context, and our church would kind of say we have a pretty large missional presence, but the question that stirs up is like, well, now shoot, like, we're in a pandemic, like, I can't do what I used to do, or maybe it looks different. And so maybe think on this question, and then we'll dive into the top row. We'll introduce our sauce real quick, but the think about this question, which is this: what does it actually look like to live a kind of missional life in the midst of a global pandemic? Like, is it the same? Does it look different? Is it the complete, is it like rinse and repeat, do it the exact same, or do you have to get unique? What does that look like? And so, but with that, I have a beautiful garlic reaper sauce, which is 160,000 Scoville units. And so again, another hot one. Lucas and Liz, what are you rolling with?
I've got this thing. It's called a Green-Aid. And its expiration date, I'm happy to say, is June 2022. So I'm going to live with this one. We're going to be all right.
You're going to make it. There you go.
I have another Colombian sauce, and I talked. My sister-in-law's husband is Colombian, so this is an ají, but it's a red ají, a vinegar-based more. So not. It is spicy for Colombians.
Okay. Well, I poured way too much on mine, and so my face may melt. And so I'm going to say the question again, which is kind of, what does it look like to live missionally in the midst of a pandemic? And maybe Shane, why don't you start us off with this one? What does it kind of look like?
Just let me know if my background noise is too much. We have a massive influx of fireworks here. But I think that some things are very, very different right now, but there's a lot of things that are the same, which is, I think it means that we are really, really sensitive to those who are most vulnerable. And those who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and maybe those who are, because of their living circumstances, they are especially vulnerable, like folks in domestic violence situations where home is not a safe place. Our friends on the street who have no way to stay at home, when you're on the street. So we've been, doing a lot to try to take care of folks that can't quarantine. Folks in prison, some of the, folks that are incarcerated can't have any visitors at all. So we're trying to be more deliberate to write letters and, make phone calls when we can with those who are incarcerated. Meanwhile, our prayer has been that we would be both courageous and cautious, that we would do things wisely with social distance, with masks, but we're sharing food with hundreds and hundreds of people because folks really, really need it right now. And I think there's kind of this other thing that's happening around this powerful uprising of racial justice in our country. So we've been trying to participate in that march in the streets. We've got statues of that represent some of the worst of our history that have been coming down in Philadelphia, and so we're in the middle of the pandemic. We're also in the middle of one of the most powerful movements for racial justice, I think, in over a generation.
Yeah, so a lot of opportunity, I think, still to participate and to dive in. And Liz, what about you? I mean, kind of, how do you see the opportunity, and maybe what it looks like during this season?
Yeah, and I really appreciate what Shane had said, and especially with the uprising and the resistance. And I think in some ways, when we're starting with the coronavirus, there could have been a real tendency to navel gaze, right? Protect what is ours, our own, what's beloved, especially with stock market fluctuation. The sense of scarcity, right? Instead of trusting in a God of abundance, and let's lean on a God of abundance that will provide and care for all of God's creation.
Yeah.
And with that sense, especially in the context of the murders of Black lives, what does that mean that even in the context of the coronavirus, that we listen and attend to the work of the Spirit, and our brothers and sisters, our Black brothers and sisters are saying that enough is enough. And I think that means we do that mindfully, right, in terms of how we go out. But I think God calls us to be in solidarity with the least of these, those in the margins, and how are we participating in that? So at United Methodist Women, one of the things that we've been doing, even with the coronavirus, has been thinking about things systemically, right? There has economic fluctuations. Well, there's certainly mutual aid, but we need to put a moratorium on utility shutoffs, right? because those who are most economically vulnerable are the ones who will not be able to pay their bills. So then we've been pressing for Congress, right, very actively. Let's put a moratorium at the state level, at the federal level. Let's release those who are nonviolent offenders from prisons because their lives are at jeopardy, and really living out Luke 4. But the other thing that has been really interesting is that as we humans have been cooped up, creation has been breathing this deep exhale, right? Like the elephants, the birds are chirping louder, the elephants are coming out, etc. And so in some ways we have harmed God's creation so much that I think it's an opportunity to pause and say, thinking about John 3:16, for God so loved the world, and that was God's mission. And John 3:17 says, for God came not to condemn the world, but to save it. And save in Greek can also be translated as heal. So God came to heal the world. So I think it's a pause to say how much of our consumption, how much of the sin of our energy use, consumption from fossil fuels, that is hurting the air, harming our lungs, that is increasing the likelihood of COVID on Black communities disproportionately. How can we change these habits that have energy that is coming from healthier sources? So I think it gives us an opportunity to think about mission more holistically in caring for all of God's creation and thinking about active ways of how we can change that in terms of our own practice and consumption.
Yeah. I think John 3:17 might be the least preached verse in the Bible. People love to stop at 3:16, but really forget about 17. But that's where all the action is. Also, I love your out of office email. Didn't it say, "I'm not around, but in your time, please write to Congress"? I thought that was a great way. I love that. That was good.
That's correct. This is our spiritual act of worship.
Yeah, I love that. Was good. Well, hey, John Claude, what about for you? What do you think it kind of looks like during this season, specifically in your context? What does it kind of look like to live this missional lifestyle?
Well, my context is always different. Haiti is so special in many ways. And my friend Lucas might know what I'm talking about. Well, I would say that COVID-19 or this pandemic has given the church an opportunity in Haiti, an opportunity to lend a hand to the less fortunate, because all of the advices, all of the measures that have been taken or done in Port-au-Prince, and when you go to the countryside, as I said before, people do not believe that COVID-19 exists. But at the same time, you have many people who are marginalized, who are poor, as my friend was saying. So, I mean, they are expecting that someone who lend a hand would bring them some soap, some water, some Clorox, or something that will help them to protect themselves. And I don't want to make it personal, but even at home, usually people would come to my house to charge their phone because we've been without electricity for months now. So now what I did, I put on outside outlet, letting people come during the day and charge their phone, and I'm not charging anything. So even when I'm not there, and my logic was very simple. And even some folks were asking me why are you doing it? I said, look, God has given me the opportunity to buy 2 solar panels that I put on top of my house. As long as, God will always exist, which means that the sun will always shine, will always shine. So as long as the sun is shining, they can come and charge their phone.
Yeah.
And the other thing also, sometimes it's tough to understand because people live on a daily basis. I mean, if they don't go out, they're not going to be able to bring any food on their table. So you can understand when they do not want to stay. I mean, to stay confined at the house. And the other piece of information that was an opportunity for the church in Haiti. Well, churches in Haiti are very, not all of them, some of them are very archaic in the sense that when you ask which church do you go to, I go to the church of Pastor Lucas, I go to the church of Pastor Elizabeth. So it's like the church belongs to those people. So this time, this pandemic has given some churches to make a difference, to reach out to their brothers and sisters using the internet, either by WhatsApp, either by YouTube, preparing some short messages that they can share with the congregation. But at the same time, one of the worst experience that I've made, it is with some pastors who do not believe that COVID-19 exists. The other day, I had to close my office because there is one pastor, he's very well known. At the very beginning, he didn't believe. And then he had a very big party at his house, and this is where he got infected. And regrettably, he died. And this guy, I mean, he's wealthy. He could have found some cares. So they were, the funeral were close to my office, so we had to close the office on that day because there were many people, passing by. So I mean, it's very sad. And also, I take advantage of this situation to do some work with the youth online, because now I am doing an ecosystem assessment of information in Haiti. Where do people get the information? Where do they get it from? Do they believe the government? So now I have 20 young, while they stay at the house, they're using the questionnaire, and I'm using Kubo toolbox where they can fill out their stuff. And coming, this after the survey, there would be a report that we can share with people in Haiti. So I take advantage, of the situation, just to make sure I don't sit down idle and not doing anything, trying to bring some differences in the life of other people.
Yeah, that's awesome. Kind of capital. I mean, you said a lot of really great things, but even just ending on that idea of capitalizing on the opportunity. And this is a time that's really hard, but seeing the opportunity to actually cultivate new opportunities and new fields, and not to just see it as an end all. So, Lucas, I think you're the last one. And so what about you, man?
Yeah, it really is just echoing. It seems to me there are almost two steps here. One is the concern for the vulnerable. And I think any of us who work in this line of work, whenever there's anything that comes up that's destabilizing, we know it's going to affect the most vulnerable, the first and the worst. And certainly that's what we've seen again in this time. And so I think whenever that happens, that's whether it be a storm, whether it be some sort of political crisis, a monetary crisis, a global pandemic in this way, it's immediate sort of suffering for. And early in COVID, I heard somebody say this is a rich person's pandemic because you can buy your way out of it if food prices increase. All the different things that kind of come along with that. And so there's that. And then the second strand that I think everybody's mentioned also is the opportunity that's been lodged in it as well. What Liz is saying about the environment, what Shane is saying about the ability to kind of connect people in different ways, and in this social justice time, and John Claude with all that creativity stuff. And I think that goes back to what we were first saying of like mission's not compartmentalized. So I think people who are living and breathing this theology of mission, you just find new and exciting ways in which God's working around, and you just try to catch up with it. We'll probably talk about this at some point in time, but those people who've been around me for a while, they know that I'm a big fan of Acts 8. Often you hear the Great Commission as the call to mission, right? To go, therefore. Whereas I've always been more interested in this chariot chaser with Philip and the Ethiopian, where he's just trying to catch up to what in the world's going on around him, because that's what I feel like all the time. And so in this time of pandemic, I've seen some amazing stuff that's happened. And I've talked to people who are doing all sorts of cool stuff. And it may not be what they originally thought they were going to be doing, but it's just a matter of, okay, well, what is this? What's the opportunity right now? Where's God moving today? So I think in some ways it's disrupted, but in other ways it's the same non-compartmentalized work.
Yeah, we had a few episodes ago, we talked kind of about the future of the church, and I raised this question of like, do you see COVID as an obstacle or advantage? Not advantage, but like an opportunity. And I think one of our guests said like, well, it's obviously both, because every obstacle creates the opportunity to do something that is maybe God pushing us that direction. And so, yeah, thanks, Lucas. That was good. I'm glad you went last. You kind of consolidated all that for us. And so,
well, they all took my answer, so I had to figure out what am I going to do here. So I just said their answers again in a very cunning way.
No, it's good. Well, hey, Liz, why don't you introduce us to your sauce? Lucas, you go, and then I'll give us the question and we'll all dive in.
Sure. The next one is another ají. It's a Colombian green sauce this time, a little spicier.
Okay.
This one for me, Flavocano. That we'll see what that means. I mean, it's got fire right there on the label. That's gotta be good. Smoky red pepper sauce.
Sounds brutal. I have the Dingo Widowmaker on the label. It says 15 out of 10. So that sounds not good. So I'll take a bite real quick, and then I'll give you your question, which is this. I'm going to butcher this quote, but I think Karl Barth said something about like the idea that like we have, and maybe you guys all know this, like we have our Bible and we have like culture, or like kind of like the news in the other hand, right? Like culture should inform our theology, or at least the way we interpret what Scripture says and how we take those seriously. And I just wonder, for each and every one of you, how do you think culture kind of informs the missional direction of the church? Do you think the church is informing culture, culture is informing the church? Is it both and, either or? And so, Liz, if you're comfortable starting, would you kick us off on this one?
Sure, happy to do so. Yes, and yes.
And if you want to correct the quote, by the way, if I got it wrong,
yeah, someone else can. Went to Princeton Theological Seminary. Probably you all know a lot more, Bart. I absolutely do think that we do not live our faith in a vacuum. I think it's just incorrect to assume that, and like God speaks to us in this like divine revelation, and then it's this like monodirectional like movement, right? We have our unique identity experiences. Even when we were sharing just about our location, how we understand mission, that's the reality. And Jesus himself too, right? In terms of how he understood mission. So absolutely, I think it informs. I think about Gloria Damaraj, who's a missiologist, and she speaks about mutuality and mission. That God is already present in our world and communities. And it is this codependent, ongoing dialogue that's happening in whatever missional context we're in. And I think about like Luke, right? Even the passage that Luke 4, like who are the captives of our day? Who are the blind? Right? Who are in the margins? Who are the widows? And so really examining that and really looking at that. And Shane was talking about flipping of the tables, right? What tables needs to be flipped of our day to day? And are we participating then in God's mission? And especially when Jesus was never in the center of power, where the church often in the United States has been at the center of power for too often. So I think we have a very different location, and we must be informed by how, not as from the center, but follow Jesus to the margins. And so that means in many ways unlearning power and privilege for those of us in the center as Christians in the US.
Yeah, thank you for that. Shane, what about you? Kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think that it's so important that there's a lot of things that are being revealed right now, right, that have surfaced from the pandemic. And one of those is that, it's been said that when America catches a cold, African Americans catch pneumonia, because there's 400 years of a history of oppression and lack of access to health care and all of those things that were already costing us 700 lives a day from poverty, 140 million poor and low income people in the United States that were particularly vulnerable. So I think, in some ways that surface, someone was talking to me about the word apocalypse, and some people talk about that word as meaning the end times. But it actually literally means a ripping away of the veil, an unveiling. And I think that this is a moment of that kind of apocalypse. It's like in The Wizard of Oz when the curtain ripped away and you're like, oh, it's a little old man back there. I think we're seeing like a lot of things right now that are waking people up, that are opening people's eyes. And again, I think it's the combination of the coronavirus pandemic with this deep sense of outcry in our streets against systemic racism and the history of brutality that we've shown to African Americans and other people of color and other marginalized communities. So And that quote that you said of Karl Barth, I don't know if it's a paraphrase, but I always say we've got to read the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Or I say these days, the Bible in one hand and the Twitter feed in the other, because our faith is not just a ticket into heaven and a license to ignore the world we live in. And that's what a lot of the Christianity I grew up with was, promising people life after death, when a lot of people are asking, is there life before death? You know, doesn't our gospel have any good news to the world we're living in? And the last thing I would say too is I think there's a lot of things that are shaking, and they need to fall. You know, just like the grapevine in my backyard, it's flourishing because it was pruned. And I think that there are some things that need pruning, and some of them are theological. You know, there's some people whose their theology is not big enough to hold a pandemic. And so they end up saying things that just are terrible, like God made this happen for some reason, you know? And I don't think God made this happen. I think that God works through the cracks of everything, you know? But I think that, you know, some of that theology is sort of collapsing right now. And that's a beautiful thing, you know, because some of our theology hasn't been big enough to hold the suffering of the world. And we just need a bigger theology. God's bigger than the boxes we put God in.
Yeah, that's good. I would say this is, everything you said was really serious, but I'll also say that my mind is currently collapsing because that sauce was super hot and I'm having a really hard time focusing on all of you. But I heard what you said. It was really good. John Claude, what do you have for us, man? And I will actually, no, sorry, we'll switch. Lucas, I don't want to make you go last again. I feel like everyone stole your answer. So Lucas, you go, and John Claude, you'll wrap us up after Lucas.
Everyone provided me an answer, which is much preferable. Let me go last, and then I'll just continue to say, yeah.
No, you're up now, man. You're up now.
In a different way. Well, okay. And hope you survive. If you need to tap out because of this sauce thing for a minute.
My wife is bringing me like glasses of water, just like left.
You gotta go with milk, now. Man. Milk. That's what you're supposed to use, right? Or some sort of yogurt. Do you have a Greek yogurt there? You can dip your head in.
We don't drink a lot of milk, but
I thought that'd be good for the show. Actually, I don't know if it'd help him, but it'd be funny for us. Anyway, well, I guess with that question, you know, when you were first asking it, and in terms of Bart saying it, I mean, what, he had 20 volumes of stuff. I think you'd have a harder time finding something that Bart didn't say than did he say that. I'm sure somewhere in there you can put it together. But no, I actually thought of Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch neo-Calvinist theologian. That's who I kind of go to. So he had that, I don't know if you guys know his phrase, but he said, there's not a corner of the earth, I'm paraphrasing, that God doesn't look at and say mine. And I've always appreciated that kind of large sense. That's Shane, what you were just saying, of like weak theologies are collapsing. Great. Absolutely. That's what needs to happen, because if we don't have expansive enough theologies. And so this continual conversation about church and culture, I always find the brackish water in between the most interesting, you know. And when Eugene Peterson was translating that part of the incarnation story, he said God moved into the neighborhood. And I've always liked that, because I think that far too often, and certainly in the missional world, I think we see this replicated systems where it's like, well, why are we doing this one with a cross on it when it's happening over here in a more interesting way? And Christians have likewise had a hard time figuring out, when other people are doing really good work in the world, do they need to go baptize that thing? Do they need to, you know, come up with the Christian version of it? And I reject it. I just think that's sort of small thinking. And so I try to think, how can we work more collaboratively with that? And certainly in our world, in our missional world, we benefit from so many great resources, ideas, insights from people who are outside of faith communities. Kuyper would say, well, that's, you know, still God's reign. And I again think of Acts 8 when he's running alongside the chariot and he says, well, do you understand what you're reading? I mean, sometimes people have this altruistic bent inside, but they can't define what's the horsepower under the hood. Where does this come from? And I think that's a really interesting place for us to come and bring our own stories and say, well, this is, you know, we follow a crucified king. This is what this means for us. And so this Christian, this church and culture, man, put me right in the middle, wherever that is, with the two hands. I like that model. So yeah.
Good. Well, good. Before you throw it to you, Jean-Claude, you got some shade thrown to you for bringing it back. You're throwing your Princeton Methodists under the bus.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bart and Kuiper, come on.
All five of us? I mean, come on.
All five of you. So Jean-Claude, why don't you wrap us up? Just kind of, you think about the way that culture informs missional living. What do you think about that?
Okay. Well, I paid careful attention to what Shane was saying, and to Elizabeth, saying that we are, we have to find, I would say, we have to find the middle ground. I mean, we have to combine culture and the church mission. I have seen so many people excluded from the church because of culture, because I know of pastors who have excluded people out of the church because of culture, because of their style, because of their lifestyle, or because of the way that they think. And this should not be the way to do it. Or with culture involved. I mean, with culture, at least it should teach us who are missionaries, teach us who are pastors, how to reach out to the others. And every time that you are in this situation where you kind of marginalize this person because of his style, because of his culture, the first question you should ask yourself: what would Jesus do? And in my field of work, sometimes I meet with every kind of people, and usually in my mind say, okay, what would Jesus do? I mean, he wouldn't say, you guys, because you're of this style, I'm putting you in the corner, or you're on that style, I don't need you. Okay, he would always find the middle ground, because he was caring for the soul. I mean, for the soul, for the body, for the spirit. Just to make sure that this person stays a whole, whatever its style, whatever his culture, or whatever anything. So this would be my take on this, just to make sure that we find the middle ground, that everybody is accepted the way it is. And then another thing I'd like to add quickly is about resources. Sometimes they criticize missionaries because they are exporting their style, to third world countries. Okay, and usually people would criticize them, saying that they will not do this, and they come to other countries and they do this. And usually I would say those people come because they have a heart. Okay, you don't have to follow what they are doing, but just see the examples that that they are that they are bringing, helping somebody out of poverty, bringing water to somebody who had no hope, help build the future of somebody who had no future. And these are important points that we should reflect on.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys for all kind of the wide spectrum of that, and just sharing, and kind of now the opportunity to get to move to what is unapologetically my favorite kind of moment of the show, is where the folks that tune in get to ask you guys questions. So I don't know if you follow along in the comments or not, but people drop those in. And so if you have a question, please drop it in now. We'll do a little bit of setup in time just to get you ready. And so if you have a wing, Liz, do you have another sauce? And maybe you introduce it real quick, and then we'll introduce some sauces, and then I'll throw the questions up on the screen for you guys to be able to see them. Some look like they're kind of directed individually, but we'll direct them to everyone. But Liz, what sauce do you have?
Sure. This is red Thai curry sauce.
Okay.
Thai curry, sorry.
Okay. Lucas, what do you got?
Mine's boring. I don't have the bottle this time. It's some sort of spicy barbecue thing. This one's highly questionable, however. It may be a few years old. It was in the back of the fridge.
It's really fun.
Yeah, is it?
This is the constrictor. It's super hot. My wife brought me yogurt, and just in case. So But so here's the first question I saw on here, and Shane, it's directed to you, but anyone can kind of go at it. It says, kind of culture is criticizing mission more and more. People have even turned on Mother Teresa's legacy, someone that you specifically worked with, and kind of asking, what's your read on this cultural shift? What have we been doing wrong? Or does the world just not get it? And so there's a lot in that question, but as you see it, give our brother Chris Abel kind of some thoughts on the question he threw out there.
Well, sure. Thanks, Chris. And I don't want to take up too much space because there's a lot of wisdom in this whole circle. But I think that, of course, Mother Teresa and her sisters are called the missionaries of charity. And I think that what I'm just suggesting is that we can all see our lives missional, right? You don't just have to be in some sort of special vocation. So wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if our school teachers, our nurses, our construction workers are all thinking of our lives missionally? How do we carry God's love into the world? One of my favorite quotes is Frederick Buechner, when he says, we've got to take our deepest, our best gifts and connect them to the world's deepest pain. And when our gifts and skills connect with the world's pain, that's where the magic happens. That's where we're using our gifts, our skills, our special wiring and brains and passions in a way that is not just about paying the bills, but that's actually life-giving and liberating for other people. So that's why I think a lot of times the question that we need to be raising up a generation of young people asking is not just, am I going to be a doctor or a lawyer, but what kind of doctor, what kind of lawyer am I going to be? And I think that's, the kind of missional mindset is, as far as Mother Teresa, I think she's just a, beautiful example of someone who fell in love with Jesus and it changed her life. So I'm grateful for the mission of her life and of all the wonderful nuns all over the world that are carrying on that legacy.
Yeah. Well, Liz, this one is kind of specifically for you. And then if anyone has questions, I just saw another one pop up, but feel free to throw it in there. But just kind of asking for a first step or two towards changing collective consumer polluter lifestyle, specifically to you, kind of, I think, where you are. What have you found people are actually willing to change?
Sure. And I think part of it is really just grounding ourselves theologically, saying like, it's not just a nice thing to do and tick off the box. Like, God's love for the world and creation was regardless of humanity, right? Humanity is not for our consumption and use. Like, creation narrative, God said creation was good even before humans were created. So I think like the sense, like, do we love what God loves? Or in understanding that. And if we think about that, then sometimes our changes could be it could be as simple as changing our light bulbs to LED, right? It can be doing Meatless Monday, reducing our carbon footprint, right? So sometimes it could be as simple as that. But in other ways, being able to understand that our energy consumption, for instance, with fossil fuels and nuclear, it's actually harming not only all of God's creation and leading to the climate crisis, but also harming my neighbor, right? And the great thing is that there are cleaner alternatives like solar and wind. So I think it's some way saying like, we see the bigger picture, but because of the current energy system, the way it's connected, it requires more systemic change. Like, I myself cannot unplug from the grid, right? It's really difficult in the US current structure. So it is policy related components. And it seems like a heavy lift, but initially it's starting with a letter, right? And then you deal with letters of engagement. I'll sign a petition. I'll go to a training. Oh, I can speak at a public hearing. During EPA, it's actually not very difficult to begin to put pressure and saying, as a person of faith, as someone as God is calling me to care for God's creation, I am urging our state to have 100% renewable energy as a goal that centers equity, because we just don't want clean energy that is still harmful to our neighbors.
Yeah.
But can I just comment on Shane's, the question that was tossed to Shane?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Please do.
I think about missionaries who came to Korea. There's a lot of good that they did, but there's a lot of other problematic things, and they brought their own baggage too. And whether it is kind of elevating Western civilization, whether it is saying some of our cultural practices were not of God, and kind of delineating those things so starkly. So I think there is definitely a place to be critical of mission movement and saying what things of the mission movement in any context was of God and what things were really cultural imperialism or cultural context that really was not fully what the gospel is. So I think it is also really being able to affirm what vibrancy and activity is happening in the indigenous context wherever mission took place. So I think the church should be open to that criticism again and again.
Yeah, that's great. Would anyone else, either of the questions kind of dive it in, kind of either steps or the one that we just kind of dove into, like just for Lucas or Jean-Claude, do you want to touch on either of those at all?
I don't know, so I'd add anything of any expertise. I think what Liz just brought up is really interesting. I mean, the history of Christian mission is quite problematic in many different ways, and often it makes people, there was this book out a few years ago, Toxic Charity, which was very helpful and corrective in many ways, but I also saw how it paralyzed a lot of folks. And they said, because the other thing that's really interesting about Christian mission is it can't really be developmental. Like, you shouldn't have to have multiple degrees to be able to figure out how to do this thing, right? Like it's Liz saying, it's screwing in a different light bulb because you're being conscious about the creation that's around. And so in some ways, I resist things like that are overly critical without being constructive. But at the same time, how could we not look at the history of what's gone on and say that a lot of that was something that was different than the gospel, as we would say. And so recently I wrote this article on a guy who really defied a lot of the borders and the boundaries. And I think there's a lot, and it brought me into kind of transnationalized mission historically. And I think there's a lot of fruit there for us to consider people who are border crossers, border trespassers, who have been so historically, and in pursuit of their theological beliefs. And so I think that there's a whole part of our Christian history legacy that we haven't really tapped into that comes from some different voices. And so I think a whole lot more work needs to be done on that. But I think that I think it's important because I think it also gets into the testimony of who we are in the community that surrounds us.
Yeah. Jean-Claude, is anything that you kind of want to add or touch on in just kind of the conversation that has been thrown out thus far?
Well, I will simply say that, the missionaries, they have to take the time to learn. So they must not always pretend that they know everything. So, take the time to sit down with those people that you're trying to help. They have a say, they have a voice also. And, if you combine what you know and what they know, that's the best way, that's the best approach to go about it to get any result. Because if they feel that you are doing something for them, as soon as you turn your back, they give it up. And this is an experience. I mean, this is experience I have made, even in working in development. When you involve people, so you can build on. I mean, when you involve beneficiaries or when you involve participants, you can build on the longer term. And I think this is very relevant for missionary works.
Perfect.
Yeah, can I piggyback on that real quick, Danny?
Oh, yeah.
So Jean-Claude, I mean, he's working in Haiti, which is like one of the places where this happens all the time, including with our tribe of Methodists many times. And so I've been to Haiti many times, but do I speak Creole? No. Do I, Jean-Claude? How is my Creole? See, right there. And it's like,
not good.
Yeah, exactly. But yet we're so like, so many times, that's what I would say to people who would say, well, you know what Haiti needs? I've heard that so many times, you know what Haiti needs? And it's like, oh my gosh. So I would say, can you tell me in Creole? Because if you can't even start there, like we have no business, and you have no business telling me what you think this is either, right? So this whole idea that listening to the funds of knowledge that are in the communities, I mean, this is something that's been exciting, a change that's taking place in the last 20 years, I think, or so. But let's see where it goes, because it's necessary.
Yeah. Well, I'm fine with Lucas having the closing thought, but does anyone else want to have the closing thought after Lucas? Perfect. Well, hey, Here's what we'll do. We'll actually, we had a great comment that I think actually encapsulates close to what we had as kind of our last question. So this will go down in history as the first user comment to be the final question of hot thoughts. But if we would, I would just say, Liz, do you have a hot sauce to end with? We'll introduce and we'll go in. 2 million Scovilles over here.
Wow, sriracha.
Oh, that's my favorite. Lucas, what do you got?
I don't even know what it is. I just put it on. I can't remember if this is a barbecue. I think this is another hot sauce that's not meant for
us, Lucas. You don't tell us spice level. You just tell us expiration date. So where's yours at on expiration date?
This one I'm less concerned about, and actually that barbecue thing wound up being pretty spicy. Which again, not sure if that came from the manufacturer that way or if it just turned that way. Or maybe it fermented in my fridge. I don't know. But this thing, I don't know. I feel more confident that I won't die.
Yeah. Well, hey, let's take a bite. Shane, you want to open us up on this question, which is just this kind of, with God at work all around us, how do each of you guys kind of determine your efforts and your energies or the energies of the organizations each of you kind of get the opportunity to speak into and lead?
Sure, I can start us out on that one. I really I like this question because there are so many different things that it's easy to just kind of jump from issue to issue as if these were not kind of interconnected. And that's why I really like to start with relationship and with proximity, because I think a lot of times we don't have a compassion problem. We have a proximity problem, right? We have a relationship disconnect. And what happens in Jesus is that God become proximate, and God moved into the pain, put skin on, moved in among us. And in some ways, it's a privilege to be able to choose which issues we care about and which ones we don't. A lot of people, these issues have chosen them because of their context or the color of their skin or what they're born into. So I think for those of us that are choosing to get involved, we need to have the right posture. And to me, that means not being quick to be a voice for the voiceless, because a lot of people have voices. And rather than speaking for people, we need to hold the mic. We need to amplify the voices and the pain that is not being heard. But that all comes, I think, in the context of relationship. Mother Teresa, she had a great line. She said, "It may be very fashionable to talk about the poor, but still not very fashionable to talk to them." If we care about issues like immigration, then we should sure know the name of some of our dreamers and DACA recipients, some of the immigrant families. If we really care about gun violence, we should be amplifying the voices who have been directly impacted. So that would be my thought on this question, because when we lean into the people, the issues, you can't help but get active in trying to change those injustices when you know the people who have been squashed by those injustices.
Yeah. John Claude, just to kind of remind you the question, but what are your thoughts on this? Just kind of with God at work all around us, kind of where do you determine efforts and energies of you and your organization?
Okay, and I really like Jen's take on this, amplify the voices of those who are marginalized, just to make sure that they are not just passive receivers, that they are involved at some point of the process. And I would say sometime you need to put aside the professionalism, the missionary side, and have some humanity. And I'll give you a quick example. And I remember a few years ago, I was working for a big organization. I will not say the name. But I was involved in sponsorship, writing stories, showing the contrast so that more money can go to the organization. And I would take foreign journalists when they go to write the stories. But one day I went to a place, so we went to a school, interview a young girl, nice uniform, school paid, food at the school. But at the same time, we had to go to the community and show the contrast. We went to a place where this little girl, 7 years, she hasn't eaten for days. So when we wrap up the story, because I couldn't beg myself to leave and not giving them some money from my pocket. I mean, to make sure that to make sure that they have a lunch, because I couldn't use the organization money because I would have to justify it. I would need a receipt, an invoice, okay? But from my own pocket, I wanted to make sure that this girl, I mean, he has food. So sometimes we have to preach. I mean, we have to practice what we are preaching, and sometimes just put aside, the professionalism, put aside, the pastor side, and show some humanity.
Yeah. Practice what we preach. That's like the ultimate thing right there, to actually live what we're talking about. So, Lucas, what about you? Kind of, I'll put the question back up for you to see it, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's going to sound similar, surprisingly. The first question that you asked, which was very similar to this, I kind of took some quick notes earlier today, typed down what I thought, and I said, first lead with your ears, and then I added those words, dignity and proximity, which Shane explored very eloquently. I really think that's what it is. It's we don't have to create all this stuff. Often I tell people, just leave your ideas at home, like just come with your ears, talk, engage, and then really those two complementing factors of having dignity both for yourself and for the other, whoever it is that you're interacting with, and proximity. That I think those are the critical elements. If you got those things right, you can mess up a whole bunch of the other stuff. You can, try an effort that doesn't work quite right. You can have to adjust this direction, but as long as you're maintaining dignity and proximity and you're leading with your ears, looking for those places where you can amplify and what your specific role is in that. I think that's what it is. I think that's how we do that.
Awesome. Well, Liz, you want to wrap us up on this one?
Sure. So I appreciate the question, and and even the way it was framed, right? With God at work all around us, how do you determine? So I think one thing is to recognize this is God's work, right? I am not God. Like, I do not need to solve every single problem. I mean, I remember having conversations with God, why all this mess exists for centuries, et cetera. That's a different story. But, we are part of God's mission. And I think if I remember that I am part of the body of Christ that is working and animating, and discerning what role can I particularly play with my particular skills, interests, location, how can I be faithful, and discerning within community and wise counsel about what that call might be. I think that is more important, but I do sometimes think that we think about mission as ours instead of God's, and that leads to a whole slew of problems. And I think about Esther, right? For such a time as this, that it's my call. I have a passion for human rights, gender justice, and that connection with kind of, as people of faith, how we respond. But the reality, the reason I'm doing climate work is we have a climate crisis, and the lives of women, children, gender justice, women's rights and human rights are fundamentally being disrupted and harmed because of the climate crisis. So how do I respond? Well, then I want to tackle climate crisis, right? Because it'll require all of us. So I think it's really important to couch it within the reality for such a time as this. What is going on in community? Where is the pain? Where is the areas where God longs to break in and is already doing work? And how can we, as Christians, be part of the process, right? And we might be just supporting. We might actually be doing a lot of repenting, in fact, but being prompting of that. And especially in the United States with racism that's at play and the church's complicitness with that, I think we need to be responsive, that this is a missional moment of both lament, repentance, and seeking racial justice in all forms.
Yeah, man. Thank you all for sharing that. And I imagine that we're at like an hour and 13 minutes. I imagine each of you could talk for an hour and 13 minutes or more on this because you're so passionate about this. And I'm not concerned about time, but I do want to make sure that I value yours. And so I just want to quickly go around and end with just like, this is your final take. And so I didn't send you guys this as a thing to prep for, but like, this is your soapbox to stand on, so to speak. This is your chance to speak to the audience that'll hear this, to say what's on your heart and to share, or maybe even be a call to action. And so Lucas, with little preparation, do you want to give us your final take, and then we'll go around and we'll wrap us up?
Now, when we're supposed to pass the offering plate, isn't that usually what happens? So send your love gift too. No, I think that's great, Danny. I guess for me, one of the things that I think has risen in this conversation today is really the resistance to compartmentalize how God is going to work in the world, in your life, and in your neighborhood, however it may be, and to really let that relax you quite a bit, that you get to be a participant in this kind of work. I mean, I think that's what I think day after day is this. I'm just trying to catch up to what God's doing in the world. And so just look around, keep your ears open, your eyes open. You're going to find a bazillion opportunities over the course of the day to live this gospel life.
Awesome. Jean-Claude, what about you? Kind of any final thoughts to leave our audience with?
Yes, and I really appreciate Elizabeth takes on a few things, and I really like the theme of social justice, social or climate justice, I meant to say. And I don't know if you knew climate change is a gender issue, so that's something we can talk further. But I would say that now we have to act, we have to do something good wherever God put us, and it does not have to be big. I mean, either to bring a smile on for somebody, for a child, to lend a hand. So this would be, I mean, this is how I see life. Every day you are thankful for what God has given you. I mean, either knowledge or wealth or anything, and how can you use it to better somebody's life? And this is usually how I go about it. And this would be my message to each of you, and also to the people who are listening to us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jean-Claude. Shane, what about you? Kind of just closing remarks, final take before we depart.
Yeah, sure. I'm grateful for the conversation and grateful for the excuse to eat the wings. When I went to seminary, we talked a lot about exegeting scripture, and that's a fancy word that means we want to try to hear the scripture in the context it was written in, kind of listen with first century ears. But there's another theologian, Ray Bakke, who is a dear friend, and he says we also not just need to exegete scripture and understand it, but we need to exegete our time and our place. And we need to ask the question, what does it look like to live the mission of Jesus for such a time as this? As Liz was saying, we need to, and I think this is an amazing moment to be alive, where that verse in Romans is on my heart, that the entire creation is groaning as in the pains of childbirth. And I can't speak as an expert on this, but I hear when you give birth, that there's tears, there's blood, there's pain, there's sweat, and then something new is born. And it kind of feels like the entire creation itself is groaning. Our brothers and the sister in the streets are groaning, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And I think that this is a moment that is pregnant with hope and possibility that the world can be different. So those of us who have faith, who believe that there's a God at work in all this, all the more should be trying to build a world that we are proud to call home. So thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Liz, you want to wrap us up?
Sure. There's been so many good things said. I think I've said this before. I think Scripture is pretty clear that we are to love God, love neighbor, humans, and all of God's creation. And if we're not doing that actively, we're complicit in harm. So if we're not part of healing and restoring our relationship with God and its fullness, our relationship with others, and seeking restoration for all of creation, I think we are actually in a river going in the wrong direction. So I pray that and that we don't do it alone. I think that's a big problem. And then United like U.S. like individualism, this rugged individualism. We do it in community, so we should, yeah, as Lucas said, not bear this burden of this individual like responsibility, but we do it in community, and we extend grace together because we're participating in something bigger than us and something that God calls us to in incredible wholeness.
That indeed. Well, amen to that. And this is something I think bigger than all of us. And the conversation is bigger than any one of us. And I was just honored to get to participate in this with the four of you. And I think someone maybe said something to us like, it's great to have the conversation, but there's also like, what is God kind of compelling us to go and do about it within relationship, within context where we're at. And so my hope for anyone that's watching now live or later down the road, that this kind of stirs the conversation of where can God use the intersection of my passion and the world's great need to find kind of our calling and our place within that. And so I want to thank all of our guests. I want to invite people to make sure they join us back next week for Volume 8 of Hot Thoughts. We keep it going, and we will see everyone back here again next week.
Thanks so much.
See you later.
Okay,
Thanks.
take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.